Well, I think I can say good afternoon. If not, we might just be a minute off. Welcome to the East Tennessee History Center for the East Tennessee Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture on Carson Newman with David Needs. We're tickled that you're here. My name is Lisa Oakley. I'm Curator of Education here at the Historical Site. I apologize for my voice. But I wanted to welcome you and let you know some things that are going on before we start the lecture. We are really excited. On August the 15th, we have our history fair that will be kicking off, and we will be commemorating and thinking about and anticipating not only this celebration of 250 years of our nation's history and accomplishments and challenges and all that involves, but also challenging and asking folks to think about through activities, what are we doing today and what can we do towards the future? So I welcome you to come and enjoy the activities and the history, and also come and engage and share with us your thoughts and ideas for the future. And to prepare us for that to some degree in thinking about the 250 and particularly women's roles in the Revolution, including some Tennesseans, East Tennessee women. We will have Denise Kiernan here on Friday evening, the night before, from 5:30 to 6:30. She'll be speaking, and her new book is Obstinate Daughters. And the book is available if you want to purchase it ahead of time. You can, of course, purchase it then as well. But hopefully you're familiar with her work on the women in Oak Ridge. And she is going to be coming now. She's been looking at those women that were involved earlier in the founding of our nation from all different perspectives. So we're really excited about a couple of weeks coming up. We have a lot going on. You can find out more online. We do have these cards that are on the table. I welcome you to take some and take some to share if you have folks you want to bring. We would love that. And then also have a moment to look at the exhibition. The lines were drawn at exhibition. Perhaps that won't be the day to do it. Hopefully it'll be really busy. But admission is free through the run of that exhibition, thanks to the support and sponsorship of Marv House. We wanted to make sure that everyone had access to be able to visit the museum and see the exhibition. And of course, we encourage folks to join, be members, to continue being involved in and enjoying our programs and our exhibitions going forward. So at any rate, we do hope that you will enjoy being with us, if not for History Fair, for our future programs and lectures, and coming back to see the exhibition. We also are beginning to look at the fall for some programming, and we will have our newsline going out if you're a member, and that will have a new updated calendar of events. But please like us on Facebook, check us out, get on our email newsletter, and we will try to make you aware of everything we have coming up, such as our talk today. David and I first got to know each other in working on the Civil War Symposium that we offered in 2024. Gosh, that's hard to believe. And all the research and all the work he's done and awards he's won with the history side of his job and the history side of his passion as Jefferson City historian. But looking at the story of Mossy Creek and Jefferson City throughout time, and today he's going to be focusing on Carson Newman. But as I said, he is the city historian for Jefferson City and serves as president of Lakeway Civil War Preservation Association, in addition to his role as instructor and director of athletics development for Carson Newman University. So when he first approached us about this program, which is in conjunction with and support from Carson Newman and getting the word out about their anniversary and their celebrations, we talked about it's always interesting to look back at those stories that we find fascinating, interesting, or that we're drawn to in our history. And sometimes people don't go as far back as Civil War or as far back as those earlier time frames. And so he's going to be doing that for us today and bringing it more towards the future. So we welcome David. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Can I mention one thing about David?
Yes.
He recently was inducted into the Carson Newman's Hall of Fame, Athletic Hall of Fame.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. I know.
But congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Danny. I'll make sure that you get that 20. I do work at Carson Newman, and it has been my great privilege to work at Carson Newman since 1996. So I've been at Carson Newman for a long, long time. I've been around some very great people. I also, as a graduate of Carson Newman, have been around some of the greatest instructors you would ever imagine. And so it is my privilege to talk about Carson Newman today and share a little bit about who we are and where we started, basically. And so I would be remiss. Cheryl Gray is with us today, and Cheryl is in charge of the 175th anniversary special at Carson, or anniversary programming at Carson Newman. And so we are about to get that started. And if you are a Carson Newman graduate and want to be connected with Carson Newman, this is a great year to be connected with Carson Newman because of all the special events that we have planned. And so getting to speak all over the country, this is one of my favorite places in the United States to speak because, one, because of the technology, but two, because of the forum in which it is. I am an instructor at Carson Newman. I am the Associate Athletic Director in charge of development, so I get to do that. I'm on the radio and TV to do football games, so I get to do a lot of different things at Carson Newman. But this one of the things I am is more so a storyteller and a teller of things that are intriguing and interesting. And so this is what we're going to try and do through today. We're going to look at Carson Newman through basically its foundation is faith, education, and an ability to adapt. And so we're going to look, when Lisa and I were talking about, how do you cover 175 years in a short presentation? And the answer is you don't, right? And so what you do is you focus on some things that are crucible or crucial times in the school's history, and then kind of bring light to them. As a historian, I love looking back. I could spend hours, even days, on newspapers.com reading old writings from newspapers from different days. And so a lot of the research has been done through some of that, and other things. Worked with the archives for some of the pictures that you see that are here, and as we go through. So we're going to look at basically the creation of the college today. We're going to look at how the Civil War affects the college. We're going to look at how it became a co-ed institution. And then we're going to look finally at how college athletics shapes basically the Carson Newman that maybe we know today. And how are these moments important in defining Carson Newman? And so we want to take a look at that as we go through. And so in the 1850s, we know this. 1850s in the United States was the great decade for college expansion. That in the 1850s, there are more colleges created up to that time than in any other decade in college in the history of the United States. In fact, in the 1850s, and Carson Newman starts in 1851, 92 colleges were created in the United States. When you think about the United States and the size of the United States at that time, that's an impressive thought. As you look at that, in the previous 2 decades combined, there had only been 80 created, right? So a lot of schools in the 1850s. So what is the reason that a lot of schools come about in the 1850s? We know the 1850s is the decade before the Civil War, but why would there be such a need to create a college in the 1850s? And part of that is the great Whig movements of the 1840s and 1850s, where you have this growing middle class, this kind of in its infancy and earlier industrial class, a class of people that weren't necessarily farmers, that they were wheelwrights or they were small businesses, that they had shifted their focus from the family farm and then trying to sell and market into trying to occupy an industry. And so there's this growing middle class in the United States of people that realize that they have a little bit more income and they want what's better, as every generation does. They want what's better for their children than what they had. And so what do they do with that little bit of extra income that they have as a middle class person? They want to send their children off to school. And so there is this idea then that with a developing middle class, we need to train professionals that go forward. We want teachers and preachers, and we want other professionals that are going to go forward with that. In East Tennessee, the Baptist denomination had grown to the point where it was one third of all people in East Tennessee identified themselves as Baptist. Yet there's no Baptist university in East Tennessee, or Baptist college, more so. And so the people within the denomination, as you start to read through different articles, are saying, we need to have a school that turns out preachers so that we can have educated preachers in our pulpit and create more interest in the Baptist church so that people will then go and they'll go out and create a stronger denomination. So in East Tennessee, there is this idea, and we're talking about 1840s Tennessee, which, Nashville and Memphis are certainly cities growing, and Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee are, but the economic power, the population power is still a little bit in East Tennessee at that time. So there is that. In 1842, we read an article in the newspaper that says basically there's a call within the denomination to have a Baptist college, and Mossy Creek is mentioned. In fact, here's the article right there. Mossy Creek is mentioned in 1842. There's Leah Springs. I'm not sure exactly where that is. Somebody in here probably could educate me as to where that is. There's some other places in East Tennessee that are mentioned, but Mossy Creek is one of the places that is mentioned in 1842 as to a place that is. So you sit there and say, well, Mossy Creek, that's modern day Jefferson City. Some of you may have been to Jefferson City, have lived in Jefferson City, and know it well, especially if you went to Carson Newman, you certainly know it. But I've run into some people recently. They're like, I've lived in Knoxville all my life and never been to Jefferson City. And you're sitting there thinking, oh goodness, it doesn't create the same impression. But if you were an East Tennessean in the 1850s and you traveled at all, you would have traveled to Mossy Creek, because if you left Knoxville heading north, Mossy Creek was the place you would have stopped. That would have been one of your primary stops along the way. So why Mossy Creek for a college? Well, it was one of Tennessee's larger towns, and you're looking and you're saying, Jefferson City? Get out of here. But, and I'll show you population studies that show that here in just a second, but it also didn't have a college. It was unincorporated, which means that it wasn't officially a town by its nature, but it was a town, right? It didn't have city government or anything like that, but it did have a great population. It had water power. So Mossy Creek is named after the creek that comes out of the water, comes roaring out of the water in several thousand gallons every second, and creates a creek that runs through what would have been the town at that time. In those days, not now, it's just kind of a meandering creek that kind of carelessly goes through. But in those days, it had waterfalls about every 400 feet. 6-foot waterfalls to a point where at one point it had a 30-foot waterfall. And so it was a source then, and waterfalls in those days were a source of power because you could turn a water wheel with a current. And so because of that, you had tool factories there, right? So we're talking about 1840s, 1850s agrarian East Tennessee, and Mossy Creek is a center for industry. Tool factories, water wheel, it produced jeans, right? Like they didn't make blue jeans, but they made the material that made jeans. They had satin net. They had other things because a lot of the farmers that would raise sheep or raise wool would bring that there. They had sawmills. In fact, there's a part of town that they called Sawmill Holler. They had a grist mill. And eventually they would find the richest zinc deposit in the continental U.S. at the time that they had found. And so there was zinc even there. So it was a stopping point on the stage road. It was a stopping point on the mail road. It was a place. It was the most common travel routes. If you're going through East Tennessee, this was the place that you went. And with the water, some would even like the Tate family would bring water bring things down to Holston to sell here in Market Square. So they would bring a barge and they would go down the Holston River and go there. In 1851, we know that the East Tennessee Railroad came to Mossy Creek. You say, why would that be important? Because up to that point, travel was strictly by foot or by horse. And now with the railroad, you could link Knoxville that much easier to other places in the United States, and Mossy Creek was a stop along the railroad. And so by having a stop in Mossy Creek, you read accounts about people that used to, on Sunday after church was over, get on the train and they would ride to their relative's house in Morristown, and they would never have been able to do that before, that they would sometimes go months without seeing each other, that now people were taking the train everywhere. So you have cities and towns that were growing, and you would have farmers that were now bringing their produce and everything to the train station to be able to be sold not just in Knoxville, but in Charleston, in Washington, D.C. So it linked Mossy Creek with the outside world. There was always a strong supporter of education in there. So when people moved, it had a Quaker community, it had a Methodist community, it had a Presbyterian community, it had a Baptist community. And there was this idea that people there needed to be educated, whether that was through the Quaker background or wherever. There was this idea that the community needed to be educated. So the public school systems, as such as they were in those days, were particularly strong, with a strong sense in the community that everybody needed an education. Whether that was a month between planting seasons and harvest season, whether that was 3 months, whether that was all year round, there was this idea that education was important, especially in that community. Especially with middle class people, there is this strong idea. And it had one of the largest Baptist, in size, one of the largest Baptist churches in East Tennessee at the time, at the Mossy Creek Baptist Church. So it could house more people than others. So there's this, and lastly, there's this strong sense of national and regional pride. A lot of people there at that time could trace their lineage to some of the Creek Indian Wars. They could trace their history to the War of 1812. Some could even trace their family's history back to the American Revolution. So there was this idea, and they came from all over, so there was this connection with the federal government, more so than even the connection with the state government. There was this idea that they were proud Americans. They were proud Americans, and there was this great sense of pride that they picked East Tennessee to settle. You have Scotch-Irish immigrants that settle there also, and they have this because it reminds them of home. So you have this strong sense of independence, but a strong sense of pride into who they are. So there it is on a earlier than 1850s map. I've told people before, Congressman Phil Rowe, when he was a congressman, made it possible for me to go into the Library of Congress. Now, anybody can do this, but he just had it expedited for me, that I got all the maps of East Tennessee basically from about 1840 to 1870 in the Library of Congress. And this was one of them. And so if you look on the map, you can see where Mossy Creek is on the map and where Knoxville is. And you see the rivers. You notice if you're familiar with the geography, no lakes, right? Just rivers, right? So you have the Holston and you have the French Broad and you have the land between the two rivers. We call this area the Lakeway region. Well, now I guess we would just call it the land between the two rivers region, right? In that area. Rich, fertile farmland. You're between two rivers, hilly, but rich, fertile farmland. Okay, so it was such that it was there. A lot of farmers in those days were doing a lot of innovative things to kind of cultivate the land as best they could. We know that they grew peaches in Mossy Creek. We knew that they did a lot of different things from a farming standpoint that we're trying to do. There's a farm that's still there, and they don't use the plow. They don't scrape the ground, right? They don't turn the soil over. They just rotate crops. And that was a big part of this idea. So here's that census that I told you. If you look down here in the highlight, unincorporated towns, 1,920. Now this is post-Civil War census. Before the Civil War, before there was a kind of a moving out of Mossy Creek, those numbers were actually higher. But you see where it is, even post-Civil War, that where it would rank in the state of the biggest cities in Tennessee, right? Because those are all the big cities. So you have Knoxville post-Civil War at 8,600, and you have Mossy Creek at about 2,000. Really, that number was about 2,500 before the Civil War, maybe as many as 3,000, and Knoxville was smaller. So you think about Mossy Creek, Jefferson City being a third of the size of Knoxville? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, and you notice that Morristown and some of the other towns that are big on there, and Maryville only has less than 1,000 people in there. And so it is a big town in the sense of what a Tennessee big town would be. So we'll get into the Mossy Creek education a little bit. So there's this need and call for Mossy education in Mossy Creek. We know why they wanted to be there. So now, what happens? What is it? What's the school? And so these are the original college buildings. A picture taken later after 1850s, but those are the original buildings for the original college. So Mossy Creek is a lot of the things you'll see in newspapers and accounts is it's a place with thriving industry and a bustling town constantly reinventing itself. It is known for one thing till a new industry comes along like the zinc mine, and it redefines itself as one of the richer zinc deposits. It is known for producing this kind of crop. Then somebody comes in and introduces a new crop to the area, and the area reinvents itself. You have people, you have farmers, you have professionals, you have doctors that are constantly learning, reading, and trying to find new ways to improve themselves. It's that 1800s mentality that if you don't like something about yourself, read about it and then change it. And so that was kind of that mentality of that era. And learn. Read and learn. And so it was an area that certainly supported learning. So where do the first classes occur? Well, this is part of what Carson Newman inherited or was given a piece of property on the east side of campus across Mossy Creek. And it now sits on the original campus. And you notice the triangle right there is the Mossy Creek Baptist Church. And you say, well, why would you put the church in the shape of a triangle? Because that was how the church was built, in a triangle. And people ask me all the time, well, why would you do a triangle? Well, to most who would say in that day, it would be the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, right? And so that's why a lot of times they would build a church. It's a Baptist church, so it needs to be near water, right? Because you got to be able to dunk people from time to time. So you got to have a Baptist church there. It is on the Dandridge Road, which is a connection between Mossy Creek and Dandridge. It is right off of the Knoxville Road, which is now we would know as Old Andrew Johnson Highway. Wouldn't have been called that then, obviously. And then it's right next by the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. There's also the bend of the Chucky River Road that comes in right there, which we now know as Chucky Pike. And so you have this crossing point, and the church is central in all of that. And so this is Mossy Creek Baptist Church is where they decide, after much debate. There's a legend at Carson Newman that there were 5 people that got together under an oak tree at some point in the 1840s and said, let's start a college. And they were leading citizens at the time, and they discussed finance, and they put it together. And for a year or two, they meet at the Baptist church there in town. Okay, so there they are. It's an all-male school. It's an irregular school. It's a prep school, and it's a college. So you could be from kindergarten through a college graduate there, basically. Now, there weren't kindergartners in those days, but you could be of the youngest age all the way through college. There were people of all ages that attended. It met first at the Baptist school, and after 2 years, the Baptist said, you got to go. Don't want you here anymore. There's not enough room. You're interrupting the flow of the church. Even though the president of the university was often the head pastor or preacher there at the church. And so they were given land by John Roper Branner. John Roper Branner was the president of the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. He was a Mossy Creek citizen, and I've talked about him before. When the railroad was talking about coming through Mossy Creek, they were going to build it where now Highway 11E is, and he said, no, I own land along the creek. Use my land. I'll give you the free land for the station. I just have one stipulation. Every time a train comes through, it has to stop in Mossy Creek. And then he built restaurants, he built stores, and he built places, and he got so rich in doing it with this new invention called the railroad that they made him the president. And so John Roper Branner was the president of the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. So he gives the college the land of some of his land, and they build on that land. So they built an academic building and then 2 dormitories. Not dormitories in the sense that we would know them. They were basically boarding homes that could house 84 men. It had a kitchen, a dining room, a lobby, and a pump house. Meaning that if they wanted water, they had to go down to the creek and get the water. There was no running water. So I would imagine if you were a freshman or a high schooler, and hazing was much more common in those days, you were on bucket patrol very, very often. And so the original cost of all the buildings was $10,840. Okay? Which isn't a lot today, but then certainly was. They made bricks out of the local clay. I found some of those original bricks, and you see flecks of limestone and other things in those bricks. They fired the bricks right there to make the buildings. Ironically, for a college that was starting, and it was started to become a training school for future preachers, the first graduate's a doctor. Okay, so it was not Richard Scruggs is the first graduate. He becomes a doctor. He settles in the Sweetwater area, and his mother is first cousins with David Crockett. All right, so that's, I guess everybody in East Tennessee is related to David Crockett at some point or another, but they were first cousins. And so, which we know that the Crockett family owned land on Mossy Creek at one point or another for a short period of time. So, that is where it is. You would not recognize the college in the college sense if you went back and visited in time. If you were in the church or in that first administration building, because it specialized in Latin and Greek and literature and philosophy and morals, mathematics, history, natural sciences, writing, but it was not in the true sense of a school with a major and you moved on an academic course. It was more of one of the authors, Dr. Carr, who wrote a book in the 1950s about Carson Newman for its 100th anniversary, basically said it was the equivalent of a modern high school in those days. That it wasn't the level of education wasn't at its highest, but they did a very good job of adapting and creating. So the cost was $12 per session. $12. Think about that, and what the cost of things are. Now at Carson Newman, for everything but books, it's approaching $50,000. Okay, for a year, so $25,000 per session. On top of that, you had to pay for your room, which was between $3 and $6, because until the dorms were built, you stayed at a boarding house, and your board or your food was $4 a month, is what it cost to eat there at the school. And then if you went to the academy as a high schooler or elementary school person, it was $5. So tuition could be paid by money or by check, but also by produce, with labor, and by meat. And that was, I read that. All right, imagine going and you show up and you bring beef to pay for your college education, or a hog to pay for your college education. You could pay for your school with meat, right? And so that was part of where they were. There's by 1865, there's 167 students. There's 3 faculty. President Anderson, R.R. Bryan, and B. Goforth. Very versatile instructors. They talk about that R.R. Robert Reedy Bryan was somebody that electricity flowed through his teaching. That he was so engaging to his students that the students were so amazed with that. And you had to be versatile in those days because you taught several subjects, and you had to be at a place where you had to be so versatile that you could be somebody that could teach, much like an elementary school teacher has to be so versatile, much like people just that need to be able at a place where they can do what they need to. So most college students in those days were from a wealthy background, or they were sent by their home church. And there was a deal in those days that if your home church sent you and vouched for you, you could go for free. If you were going to go into the ministry. And so this idea was that you have some people that are being extremely well off that are there, that their parents just want them a better education. And then you have some people that their local church says, this is a young man with gift that will be a great preacher someday, that someday maybe will take over our church or another church. And so they go through. They had two big rules, and that was you can't bring a deadly weapon, and there was no alcohol on campus. Okay, and so Carson still is a dry campus, and you still can't bring deadly weapons on campus. So those rules have still stayed in place for a long, long time, right? And so that was a big part of where they were. So if we stood on Mossy Creek and you looked up and you were looked really at the back of the baseball field, this is the view that you would have seen then and where you would be now. So if you were at Mossy Creek and you were looking up, you were kind of behind Tar Chevrolet and the mobile homes that are back there, and you were looking up the hill. That's where you would see as you went through. And in the 1850s, so it starts off as Mossy Creek Missionary Baptist Seminary. I know there are several Carson Newman graduates in this room. That would be a long name on the diploma. And so instead it becomes the Mossy Creek Baptist College. Okay, or to those that know it best, it's just the Baptist College. They don't even use Mossy Creek. So as you see reference to it, it's just the Baptist College, which is a lot easier to say, right? No sports yet, so we don't have to worry about cheers with the name in there. But I can only imagine as you get later that if Mossy Creek Missionary Baptist Seminary had stayed, that would have been a hard cheer to get out before anything had happened during the game. And so that's what the university looks like from afar, and that is time appropriate. This is kind of pre-Civil War looking up. And if you look just right there, there's the pump house that they had down there at the creek. So there's a pump house that's down there, and you have the two administration buildings and the dorm that are there. So where is it? That's where it is today. So if you're a Carson Newman sports fan and you know the Ken Sparks building and the football stadium and the baseball field, that's where the original college was. That's the actual deed lines of the original college. So that's where it was. We've worked with the city and the county to get those numbers. And so that's the original, that's where the original college was. So if you rode up in 1850, you wouldn't even have known, you wouldn't recognize it obviously today. So that's where they are. So some things that we know from that early period is it had a strong commitment to faith. It had a commitment to education and understanding the world in a changing time. 1851, relay classes are 1852, and you're looking, and it's less than 10 years before the start of the Civil War. So you're in a changing time in the United States. Everybody knows it. There's a sense of destiny that things are coming to a head. In 1861, as some states have already left the Union, they have a revival on campus, and you see 23 students have joined the church and 15 have professions of faith in 1861. And this is a time period where you have some that know that they will maybe fight for the Union if there's a civil war, and some that will fight for the Confederacy, but their faith is still an important part and they can still go and be there. A lot of the early speakers that they bring in to speak, they brought Brownlow up, they bring Horace Maynard up to speak, who was a leading politician in the area at that time, is a slave-owning, pro-union Whig. And there's a lot of different things wrapped up in that. But he speaks to the college. They had two literary societies, the Columbians and the Philos back then, that drove a lot of the conversations that they had. That the literary societies would be in charge of picking who the speakers were to come in and address the university. Upstairs, in the special collections that they have the Albert Brown letters. And Albert Brown was a student at Carson Newman in 1861. He was from Georgia, from North Georgia, and he's writing a letter home describing his college life there. Two parents in Georgia, and Georgia has already left the Union and is part of the Confederacy. And he says in the letter, it feels weird writing to my parents in a different country. Inside of the same letter, he talks about a speech contest that they're having on campus, and the winning prize is $50. And you think about $50 in those days, That's basically 2 years of college education paid for free for the winning prize. And it talks about going to church, and it talks about spiritual relationships. At the same time, he talks about he hates the people there that are pro-union, and that he has problems with them. And in this area of the country, some of that is the case. And so there's this area where it cares about education. They care about the times that are there. They care about creating educated citizens. They're not afraid to confront the issues of the day. And that would characterize the early college and how it looks at things, that they looked and said, we want to create an impact in the world, so in order to create an impact in the world, we got to understand the world. And so they do. So war comes about, and basically Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. And so we're moving into a part that usually I spend an hour on in my talks that I'm going to try and condense into a few minutes. Okay, so but we'll try and do this. So Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. Many of the Whigs, the people that believe in a strong connection to the federal government, they believe in this idea that if you're a Tennessean, that your connection is better with the people in Washington, D.C. than it is in Nashville. It is not a slave-driven economy and agricultural-driven economy based on production with the assistance of slavery, but instead a middle-class economy with connections to better road systems and the federal government. But a lot of those Whigs had to make a choice. They had to make a choice as to where they were going to go, with the Union or the Confederacy. In 1861, February of 1861, they take a vote to remain in the Union, and there's strong support in East Tennessee to remain in the Union. After Fort Sumter and the call for troops, lines are drawn as Lincoln calls for troops to put down the rebellion. And a lot of East Tennesseans, that was just the tipping point where they decided that they would rather fight for the Confederacy because their tie was to Tennessee, who was leaving, than it was to the federal government. To a lot of Tennesseans, though, they believed in the federal government so much so that they were willing to make themselves an outlaw and stay with the federal government. A lot of the pro-union people were arrested and sent to prison in Alabama. Horace Maynard was arrested and sent to prison in Alabama, okay, because he was pro-union. Andrew Johnson, they tried to get a train to go up to Rogersville to capture him so they could execute him. And so there were a lot of pro-union people in this area. But in June, when they leave, with Union support still strong in the region, two former pro-Union Whigs, Benjamin Branner, not John Roper Branner, his brother, and William Brazelton, who is a founder in Newmarket, recruit and raise Confederate cavalry to fight the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln, is what it says in the newspaper article. They said to fight off old Abe's tyranny, it says in this one article, okay, that Lincoln was coming to send troops to invade the South. And so these traditionally pro-union Whigs decided it would be better to stand with Tennessee. And so they create their own regiments, attracting a lot of young college men and high school men to come serve with them. And so there is a huge propaganda campaign going on both sides about what side East Tennesseans should be on. And so two of the more prominent wealthy citizens in those days decided it would be better for the Confederacy. Now, I'm of the theory that as much as there are several causes for the Civil War, economics is a huge one. And so if you're Brazelton or Branner and you own a lot of land and you have a stake in the power that exists right now, you're going to fight to make sure that a new order doesn't create it when the Union comes in and invades, and maybe middle-class people get to rise and we have to fall back. So a lot of well-to-do people would convince people that aren't as well-to-do, you're going to lose your rights if you don't fight for the South. And so they recruited a lot of people to fight for the South under this flag of patriotism that wasn't necessarily that, okay? So the war timeline in that area that we want to make sure that we cover is just that basically in the fall of 1861 into 1862, Union men burned the railroad bridge across Mossy Creek. In 1862, the college closes, and a lot of the young men have decided where they're going to serve. So college couldn't exist after 1862 because nobody was going to school there, right? Nobody went to church in that area either, because if you went to church and you brought your horse and you tied your horse up there, if the wrong people came through, they would just take your horse. Or they would raid your farm while you were at church. So nobody just even left home. It's kind of like COVID, but you didn't leave because you were worried about things being stolen, okay? And so in 1863, Colonel William Sanders leads his famous raid, of whom Fort Sanders is named, and he starts in Loudon and he goes all the way up to Mossy Creek, and he burns the bridges there and makes a little push onto to Knoxville, and ends up in Mossy Creek, and then he goes north. But he burns the bridges across Mossy Creek again. In 1863, Burnside recaptures in September. Burnside recaptures Knoxville and sent troops up to Mossy Creek, even as far as Morristown. In November of 63, Longstreet lays siege. We had the Battle of Fort Sanders, and after it's over, he basically retreats to the northeast side, to the Rutledge side, the 11W side, and then he eventually crosses, because on that side there isn't as much fertile farmland. He crosses over the Holston and settles in Russellville and Morristown. In December of that same year, Union troops cross the Holston River and make a strong showing, and the battle line, the epicenter of the battle, is in Mossy Creek. All right, and so again, it's something that I would spend an hour on. I will cover in a few seconds here. December 25th, 1863, Union troops push into Mossy Creek and engage Confederate troops there. December 29th, to possess the corn and bacon of the area. So an author once said, the battle for a contemporary author of that time said, the battle for East Tennessee is a battle for corn and bacon. In Jefferson City this year, and first week in October, they're having the Corn and Bacon Festival. All right, and so the battle for East Tennessee was a battle for corn and bacon. Armies moved where corn and bacon was, so they could feed their armies because there was no trains to supply. So they moved through Danders. They go to, and they decided they're going to make a showing for both. Union troops split their force that day and try and protect Danders and Mossy Creek. Confederates decide they're going to attack Mossy Creek. They come in force. Union forces are on the defense. Some great people in American history, like William Jackson Palmer, who will win the Congressional Medal of Honor that founds Colorado Springs. Eli Lilly, founder of Lilly Pharmaceuticals, is an artillery captain there. You have different people, William T. Martin, that lead the Confederates. There are future governors, there are future senators that are all in this engagement at the Battle of Mossy Creek. Texas Rangers, soldiers from Pennsylvania, soldiers from Ohio, soldiers from Georgia and Alabama, that all meet. Some of the best in the Western theater meet on that day. And after an engagement that goes back and forth, the Union troops finally get reinforcements that come across that one little bridge that they built, and they are able to win. Over the next 2 years, battle lines will shift between Morristown and Mossy Creek, back and forth. And what that does is it creates great economic hardship to the people that live in the area. Because when the Union folks are in charge, they pay Union scrip. When the Confederates are in charge, they pay Confederate scrip. If the Confederates are there and you got Union scrip, you can't cash it in. So if they come and take all your hogs, or they take all your corn, you can't even use the money to buy anything. So there's a great famine and there's great suffering amongst the civilian population in East Tennessee, which affects the school, because one of the things that people do is there's these beautiful buildings. So if you got troops in the area, where do you board them? In the dorms. Where do you put your horses? In the dorms. And so they're cutting holes to create gun ports in the walls of the building. And so the college is in disrepair. The church, anything that was wood in the church, there was one Bible they said that was left open and all the wood was gone. I'm not sure. I would love to know what that Bible verse that it was left open to was, but that was where it was. And so there's kind of just a description or a look at the Battle of Mossy Creek. So aftermath, what happens is, like we said, the local economy is destroyed. It's an agriculture and industrial wasteland. There is no industry, but there is still debt, right? So if you owed somebody money, you still owe them the money. Now, you don't owe it to the Confederate government, but local debts and local contracts still had to be honored. With the buildings in disrepair, creditors at the doorstep, they have an auction in the spring or really early summer of 65 to auction the college grounds, because there's no way that they can pay their debts off. And luckily, the guy that basically owned the deed decides that he's going to buy it in an auction, John Roper Branner, and he buys it and gives the people of the college a chance to pay off their debt. And so Jesse Baker rides 3,500 miles on horseback to raise $6,500 to pay off the debt for the college, and he is able to do that. Coincidentally, they make an appeal to the federal government because the federal government did damage to the Carson-Newman property, and it is not until the 1890s, 30 years after the war, that the college will get a $6,000 gift back from the federal government. So you talk about federal bureaucracy. There you go. And as the spouse of somebody who works for the federal government, I understand it better than most. So the federal government took 30 years to pay back that to Carson-Newman. And so they do. And so on the path to becoming Carson-Newman in 1876, basically you have the old college grounds, and that's where they meet. In 1876, A.J. Montcastle, who was one of the leading citizens of the area, built this huge estate with a bunch of acreage where it is basically now in Carsonville or on Highway 11E where the Taco Bell is, right? And Burger King and others. He builds this big, beautiful house, and he decides he's going to sell it to the college, and he sells it for $13,500. So imagine a house with 20 plus rooms and 35 acres, and you're able to buy it for $13,500. You can't even buy a used car for $13,500 now. And the college buys that new building. They move away from the old building, and they move and have all their classes there. At the same time, in the 1870, they built a brand new Masonic Lodge, and the women of the area are given a chance to get a college education. It's more of a finishing school, right? You learn needlepoint and music and how to be polite in society. It's not really per se a college in the sense of where it is. In 1877, they move over to the Branner Estate, which is the Glenmore Mansion, and they have some classes with also polite society classes. In 1880, Mossy Creek Baptist is named Carson College, basically after James Carson, who right before he passes, doesn't have any children, wills his estate to Carson-Newman, and has been a leading trustee and somebody that has really kept the college financially solvent. And in 1882, the Glenmore, basically at the Branner Estate, the Branner College for Women, move over to the old college grounds and become Newman College. And it is more of a traditional academic school than it has been in any of the other places. Not all the way yet, but more academic classes. And so what happens is that women are allowed through Carson to take some classes at Carson College, and they're about half a mile apart. In fact, if you look, I'll show you that in just a second. But Mossy Creek, the population was changing, as we talked about. There's a strong commitment to education. Christian revival was common in the community. They talk about in the 1870s, there's a lot of revivals where it was so big at one church that the pastors from the Presbyterian and Methodist church had to be called in because there were so many people giving their life to Christ that they had to call in other pastors because it was going on so big. And the college had a big part of that. There was a big temperance movement that was going. They got stone buildings that are happening in place. There is this idea of growth, but in the community has always been such that it had the Nelson Mary School, which was a school for African American children, in an era where it wasn't thought, even after the Civil War, to educate there was a boarding school for African American children within Mossy Creek. There was a strong public school system. And even William Rogers, who's the first president that dies before the school can even meet its first class, was a pastor at First Baptist in Danders, had been at First Baptist in Morristown for a little bit, not as the pastor, but as a deacon there, and believed in educating children of slavery on the scriptures and the gospel. So there's this sense of community that's always there. So calls are even made. So there's a smallpox epidemic that happens in 1883. The president has just started. Bird Menard is basically the president. He's there for 1 year. He leaves because there's smallpox in Mossy Creek. He leaves. When Charles Fowler came on board as our president at Carson-Newman, within a year we had COVID. And I said, don't be President Menard. And he laughed as we were talking about that. But, there's calls, hey, why don't we combine Union and Mossy Creek and combine all these schools and make one large Baptist university? And the leaders just said, no, we like where we are. We like who we are. We don't need to be bigger. We just need to be Carson at the time, and then eventually Carson Newman. And so that's kind of where they are. All right, so just a map here. So the women are where the pink part, and Carson College is over there in the blue part. And so basically what you have is this idea then that as you go through, the women are at Newman College, the men are at Carson College. There's a boardwalk that connects the two, and they're going back and forth on the boardwalk. Women are, so they don't get their dresses dirty. And as they go through, there's a boardwalk. And if you're dating somebody of the opposite sex, you could only go to basically where the star was, and you could meet in the middle point, because no men were allowed on the women's campus. All right, women could go there to take classes on the men's campus because there's that move to be there. In April 3rd, 1889, Carson College and Newman College became merged together. Ben Hooper, who's later governor of the state of Tennessee, is a student at the time. They stage a fictitious wedding. The students are so excited they rip up part of the boardwalk and have a big giant bonfire to celebrate the joining of the two schools. That no longer will that be the case. But one of the stipulations was that women now, when the colleges merge, will no longer be treated in any way or capacity as a finishing school or anything else. It is going to be a full opportunity for women to receive a college education the same as men. And so it makes a stand in that point that women need to be educated in an era where the Industrial Revolution is taking place, that women are seen as that should be equal recipients of a college education is a progressive stand for its day. So let's talk for a second about physical education. So at Carson Newman, I'm going to shift how I do this from a presentation standpoint as we go through, and just talk about physical education and college athletics for just a second. So basically, there is, within this idea of Industrial Revolution and everything else, there's this idea then also that there's a wellness of body and mind that's connected together. Right? So there's this connection of wellness of body and mind as we go through. So women would exercise and march in the dorm, okay? Men would do some marching, and they would work with dumbbells, and they would do some things to work on their body. But there's this idea inside of this post-Civil War generation that they have to do something to physically prove their worth. See, their fathers and uncles had the Civil War to prove how tough they were. But these men and the people of that generation did not have anything yet. And so there's this call for finding a platform in which they could show their physical worth. And so it's evolving. Women are treated as equal. Well, what happens is less men are starting to come to the school. More women, less men. A lot of preachers, but that's it, right? And so also there's this college Olympics that they have, where like all the students have to participate. Like we would remember field day in elementary school, they have a field day for the college, and they still have the records for it. You know, the people competing, men and women, okay? In 1894, December 8th, 1894, the Carson and Newman Warblers played the University of U of T Tees in a football game at Mossy Creek. They said it's rained for several days, and the field was concave this way. So all the water, there was a big puddle in the middle, and Carson Newman would play the U of T Tees. This is the infancy of sports writing, so a big portion of this is talking about the chants that the teams did, what they did, who was in the stands. There was a young lady from Mossy Creek named Maud Cochran that was rooting for the University of Tennessee, and there's 2 paragraphs dedicated to that within there. I would love, as a former coach, to know what happened in the action. And, you know, it wouldn't be football as we know it, but University of Tennessee wins. And that's the first, it's an exhibition, but it's the first contest of record. The first official contest is April 27th, 1895. Carson Newman's baseball team plays the University of Tennessee's baseball team, and Carson Newman wins. All right, so, and there it is. There's the team right before the game. 1895 baseball team. You notice the derbies. No baseball hats, right? So there they are. They're out there playing baseball. You don't see a lot of gloves there, do you? Because that was just not it. right? And so that was the baseball team. So in 1903, we know that college games were forever played on the old college grounds. So where the college started was the old college grounds. Colors were also adopted in orange and blue. Orange and blue for Carson Newman. So in 1903, in fact, they have a celebration of the year in Swan Parlor, and the room is decorated with ribbons of orange and blue. And so to me, was that all that was available was orange and blue ribbons, and that's what they decided. And then since Carson Newman wears orange and blue, who knows? But that's where it is, and they play on the old college grounds, which is where the current team play. In 1908 to 1912, football was discontinued. In 1907, one of the players was killed playing football. And so they decided that they would discontinue it. Also, because the common attitude when you went to a football game was you'd say, all right, I'm gonna put $1 down that they don't get a first down. And so guys are standing there watching the game, gambling the whole time. Well, that doesn't work at a Baptist university outside the grounds. And so the Baptist fathers that were there disapproved that. And so they get rid of football till they change some of the rules. But one of the people that brought football back is a guy by the name of Dana Bible. If you don't know anything about college football, Dana Bible is one of the most important figures of the early 20th century. He's the person who invents the 12th man tradition at Texas A&M. He's the person that was basically one of the great coaches at the University of Texas and Nebraska. And he graduated from Carson Newman when they had no football. That he coached at the high school, and back in those days, if you played, you could ask the visiting team, hey, do you mind if our coach plays with us? And you could be on the team, but through college, he doesn't play, but he writes an article in the Orange and Blue, which is the school's newspaper, about the importance of games and the importance of developing the body as much as the mind. One of the early students, when they first bring it back, is a guy by the name of Bernie Moore. Bernie Moore was a great legendary football and track coach at LSU. In fact, the track is named the Bernie Moore track at LSU. He was at Carson Newman at the same time. So in this era where there is no football, two of the greatest coaches ever, and so how did they get to that place? If they didn't have that experience, they invented themselves and learned enough football. They said that Dana Bible basically traveled all over the country to learn as much football as he could from the great, like Amos Alonzo Stagg and others, so that he could learn football so that when he became his coach, he could learn how to do it to the best level it was possible. When he was at Texas A&M in 1919 and 1917 and 1920, except for the last game of the year, they didn't give up a point. Okay, undefeated and unscored on. And he was a great coach at Texas A&M, and he, like I said, he invents the 12th man tradition. He's a Carson Newman man. And every year, his father was a professor, taught Greek at Carson Newman, would come back home and would visit the father on the farm. And while the Carson Newman team was there in the summer, he would say, come to the farm and I will teach you football drills on the farm this summer. And he worked. Imagine Nick Saban vacationing in West Virginia somewhere and saying to the local university, hey, come on over. I'm gonna teach you some football in the summertime while I'm on vacation. But that's what Dana Bible did. And they asked him why, and we've done a commercial about it. They basically said, and we weren't the Eagles then, we'd become the Fighting Parsons, but he just basically said, once an Eagle, always an Eagle. You know, that there was such a connection with the community. So I've got to wrap up here, but transition to college athletics, you see when the different sports start, there's a commitment to the different things as we go through, and when they start. You see here a commitment to women and men. That while still at club sport, Carson Newman is playing sports for women and for men in this transition. And then my last real thing. In 1921, they said, we don't have enough men. We got to change who the men are at this university. How can we do this? We're going to build a building that is better than anywhere else. We're going to build this gym that's the state of the art. This is the Thompson Bowling Arena of its day. This Butler Blank Gym, it's still on campus. You wouldn't play a game in there, you get fired. Right? But in those days, it had a gym floor, it had a place for students, it had a track around the top, it even had a pool in the basement. It was the premier arena in the entire Southeast. Frosty Holt tells a story about how the university went to play at Alabama, and it was a letdown because their facilities were so bad compared to Butler Blank. And we look at Butler Blank today, I think our FCA meets there. Our track team put rubberized floor in so we can practice, do some sprint stuff. But in those days, it was the premier building. And what it does is it changes the enrollment from basically 15 freshmen in 2009 or in 1919 to 150 freshmen by 1925. that it changes the university and who the university is and what the university is. Amongst the people that it does, it attracts a higher end of athletic. There was a guy that was a pretty good athlete in Knoxville at the time that thought about was going to play a little minor league baseball in the summertime before he went to Carson Newman. A guy by the name of Roy Acuff decided he was going to go to Carson Newman and then got sunstroke and decided he would stick to music instead. But, I mean, because they built this building, there was an attraction of people that were pretty good athletes. So in conclusion, it was designed to fill a void in Christian education in the region. Carson Newman overcame war, destruction, disease, and financial hardship. Strong leadership focused on the present while preparing for the future, which has allowed Carson Newman to overcome adversity, turn out graduates who have made a worldwide impact. And just going with what the Carson Newman mission is today. Proud of its past, Carson Newman looks forward to the next 175 years to help, and this is our goal, to help our students realize their full potential as educated citizens and worldwide servant leaders. Okay. Thank you. I know we have just a minute. Is there any questions or anything that I can answer for anybody? It certainly was a fast look at the early years of Carson Newman and helping shape who we are. There's a lot of great names and great events in Carson Newman history that I kind of glossed over and went through quickly. But does anybody have any questions?
What's the enrollment now?
So if you count everything with doctoral students and everything else, it approaches about 3,000 with dual enrollment. But yeah, it's traditional undergrad is probably closer to 2,000. Yeah.
The picture of the baseball team that was there was a number 11 with the mascot.
Yes.
African American.
Yes.
When did Carson Newman start letting African American students attend Carson Newman? Do you know the year?
I don't. It was earlier than most schools in the region. I'm not sure exactly when that was. We know we've celebrated a lot of our graduates from the earlier part that in the 60s. By the 70s, by the early 70s, we had a number of African American men, because there was just primarily men's sports, that were participating in athletics with Carson Newman. But by the late 60s, I think, Carson Newman was out there with some of our students. Yes, ma'am.
You said Mossy Creek the whole time.
Mhm.
When did Jefferson City become Jefferson City?
So really at the turn of the century, around 1900, 1901, they decided that it would become the showplace for Jefferson County. And kind of a rivalry with Dandridge, they said, well, we'll call it Jefferson City to kind of supersede the importance of Dandridge within the community. So it became Jefferson City.
And does the name Jefferson come from?
Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's another thing, Lee Springs, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, but Lee Springs might be in Granger County.
Okay.
possibly Around Blaine.
Okay.
Lee family up there, it's got the name LEA.
Okay.
That might be where that's at.
Yeah, and that probably is the case. I mean, you don't know it is very large today, so they probably made the right choice as far as from that standpoint. Any other questions?
Can you explain the evolution from the Fighting Parsons to the?
Sure. So Carson Newman had a lot of nicknames from like the Warblers. There was a baseball team, they called themselves the Invincibles. A lot of times they were just the Carson Newman team. They played a game against Tennessee Wesleyan, and one of the guys that was playing in the game got in a fight with the whole Tennessee Wesleyan football team. And they had to separate them because he knocked somebody out. And then they took him back to the hotel room, and they had to hold him in his room because he still wanted to get out of the hotel room to keep fighting. And so the next day in the newspaper, they said the Fighting Parsons of Mossy Creek or Jefferson City. So we were the Fighting Parsons, and then they were also would be named the Appalachians of the South was kind of another nickname that they called Carson Newman. And then finally, Frosty Holt decided that none of those really inspire a lot of toughness, and so he did a contest, and the was basically the Fighting Eagles. The ladies were the Parsonettes, right? So there was the Fighting Parsons and the Parsonettes, and so now it's the Eagles and the Lady Eagles. So, which it's been since the 1930s. So, any other questions?
What year did the women's sports go from the club basis to the more organized?
It kind of happened evolutionary wise. I think in the 70s really is when they started women's basketball. Now, the great thing about the women's teams were like even in 1914 and earlier, they were playing the University of Tennessee and Vanderbilt, and they played a full college schedule. Just unfortunately, and Pat Summitt has talked about this, that really until the 1970s with Title IX, it wasn't a common, this is a fully funded women's team. And so they were in associations. Like our beach volleyball team, technically it's not an NCAA sport, but it is a conference sport at Carson Newman because the NCAA has not got to a place where it says beach volleyball is a recognized sport. So our beach volleyball team plays in an association. They don't play in a sport yet.
Which conference is Carson in?
The South Atlantic Conference, which is for the most part church-affiliated schools in East Tennessee, not really in Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina. Did you have anybody else have another question? Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you, Lisa, and I really appreciate it. I certainly will stay around for a few minutes if you have any other questions. But thank you for coming in here and about Carson Newman. Visit Carson Newman for the 175th. A lot of great things going on this year. And if you have any questions about those different things, Cheryl Gray is right there. Raise your hand, Cheryl. And she will certainly point you in the right direction of what's going on at Carson Newman for the 175th. Thank you.